The Arizona sun dipped below the jagged silhouette of the Dragoon Mountains, smearing crimson across the sky like blood on a torn shirt. Dust lingered low over the plains, caught in the last light. Thomas Grady rode slowly, reins loose in his left hand, a length of barbed wire coiled at his saddle horn. Another fence post to mend, another long day of solitude. The kind of silence only a man with ghosts could endure. His mare, Belle, slowed abruptly, ears twitching. Thomas narrowed his eyes. A vulture perched on a mesquite branch ahead, wings half spread like a preacher's warning. Beside it, something slumped in the dirt. He dismounted, boots crunching against the dry ground. A figure lay motionless, young, lean, copper-skinned, with black hair braided in the Apache style. Blood had dried along his side, the wound sharp and brutal, not yet touched by decay. The desert hadn't had its time with him yet. Thomas crouched. The warrior's eyes were closed, mouth relaxed, a peace that didn't match the violence on his body. His hand still gripped a broken spear, knuckles pale from rigor mortis. Grady exhaled slowly. He looked around. No sign of others, no weapons taken. Whoever did this had left him like refuse, not even worth a prayer. He straightened and tipped his hat back. The safe thing, the expected thing, was to ride on, let the buzzards finish, let the land reclaim what was its own. The town would call him a fool, maybe worse. Tensions had flared just weeks ago. Apache raids blamed for stolen cattle, missing travelers, unspoken revenge. But Thomas Grady was not a man moved by noise. He had buried too many men, on both sides of too many lines, to leave this one to rot. He fetched a shovel from his pack. The ground was dry, cracked, resistant. Each thrust of metal into earth felt like confession. He dug until his back ached, until his breath came in ragged gusts, until he hit the depth that felt right, not by rule, but by instinct. He laid the body down with care, placing the broken spear across the chest. Then he paused. From his pocket he pulled a small cloth-wrapped pouch, a keepsake from long ago. Inside, a turquoise pendant. He hesitated, then placed it gently atop the warrior's chest. As he filled the grave, the wind picked up, whistling low and steady, like breath, like song. Finished, Thomas stood still. The sun had vanished. Shadows crawled across the valley, and in that hollow hush, something shifted. Not in the earth, not in the sky, but in the space between. He mounted Belle, cast one last glance toward the grave, and turned toward home. Before the drums start beating, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss stories buried in dust and blood like this one. The stars had risen by the time Thomas reached his cabin. A pale moon hung low, casting silver light across the ranch. He unsaddled Belle with methodical care, movements practiced and silent. His hands were caked with dust, and the scent of turned soil still clung to him, but beneath the grime was something else, an unease that gnawed quiet and deep. Inside, he lit a single lantern, poured water into a basin, and washed the dirt from his fingers. The turquoise pendant was gone, buried with the boy. He didn't regret it. That token had sat in his drawer for 15 years, untouched. It belonged to a life he never spoke of. He sat for a while in the dim light. The shovel leaned in the corner, boots by the door. The room was still, but outside, the desert seemed to breathe differently. The wind carried a hum too steady to be natural. By morning, Thomas returned to the grave with a small bundle, rabbit hide, twine, 2 stones marked with ochre. He didn't know all the customs, but he remembered the signs. He had seen Apache burials before, during patrols long ago. He had watched from behind trees, hidden, the same way he had watched his own men bury their dead. He knelt at the fresh mound and placed the items carefully. A gesture, maybe a mistake, maybe a mercy, he didn't care which. On the way back, just past the edge of his property, he spotted movement by an old saguaro. An old man leaned there, wrapped in a blanket, eyes milk-white. A prospector, maybe, or something older. Thomas slowed his horse. "You put him in the ground," the man rasped without turning. "I did," Thomas answered, eyes cautious. The blind man nodded slowly. "You did it right." "You did it alone." Thomas's jaw tightened. "No one else would." A thin smile cracked the man's face. "They saw you. The ones from the hills. Not all dead sleep quiet, rancher. Thomas frowned. He deserved a grave. The old man tilted his head, listening to something far away. He wasn't alone when he died. You ain't alone now. Then with a grunt he pushed off the cactus and shuffled into the brush, vanishing as quickly as he'd appeared. Thomas sat still in the saddle, the words echoing. Not all dead sleep quiet. The phrase lodged in his mind like a burr under skin. He rode home in silence, boots creaking in rhythm with Belle's slow gait. At the cabin, he leaned the shovel against the wall again, this time with more reverence. The wind blew harder that night, snapping through the cottonwoods like whispered names. He tried to sleep, but the old man's voice followed him into dreams. Out there in the red hills beyond the fence line, something had shifted. Something had noticed. And the land, for the first time in years, felt like it was waiting. The night that followed was blacker than most. Clouds swallowed the stars, and the moon vanished behind a curtain of thick desert air. Thomas lay on his cot, arms folded behind his head, listening. The wind had calmed, the coyotes were silent. The usual chorus of crickets and nightbirds had disappeared, replaced by a hush so deep it felt deliberate. That's when he heard it. Faint, low, rhythmic. At first it sounded like his own heartbeat echoing in his ears, but it grew steadier, more distant, a drum. No tune, just repetition, a soft thump, like a palm striking hide. He sat up, heart knocking against his ribs. The sound came from the hills to the north, where the ridges broke into jagged red stone. He held his breath. Then it stopped. Thomas rubbed his face and reached for the tin cup on the windowsill. The water tasted of dust. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of the mind, maybe thunder, maybe old timber creaking in the wind, but the sound had been real. And it wasn't the kind made by weather or wood. Morning brought no answers. The sky was clear, the ground dry. Nothing stirred around the grave when he rode past. But as he turned his horse, he noticed a set of hoofprints in the dirt, deep and unfamiliar, leading away from the site and vanishing into the scrub. He crouched to inspect them. They were fresh. No wagon, just a single horse. No one had passed his way since he buried the boy. He followed the prints a few yards, but they ended abruptly at a dry wash, as if the rider had vanished. Back at the ranch, Thomas set about his chores with unusual urgency. Every creak of the barn door, every shadow that moved felt sharper. Not threatening, just alert. Like the desert had eyes now, and it was watching him back. By sundown, the sky turned gold. He lit the lantern early. No visitors came, no riders from town. Just the quiet and the weight of something unnamed pressing down on the evening. Then the drums returned. He froze mid-step. This time they were clearer. The rhythm slow, methodical, like a call. One beat, pause, two beats, pause. A third, softer, as if answering. He stood by the window, staring at the horizon. The hills lay still in the dusk. But the sound didn't come from them. It came through them, like something echoing beneath the stone. No one else could hear it. He knew that instinctively. It wasn't meant for everyone, it was meant for him. The war had taught Thomas many things, how to shoot, how to march, how to kill. But it also taught him something rarer, how to listen. And in the silence after those drums faded, he realized something old had awakened, something that remembered. And now it had begun to listen back. The third night came with the same heavy silence, but this time Thomas didn't try to sleep. He sat near the fireplace, a low flame crackling beneath the iron pot, watching the shadows shift against the log walls. The drums had not returned, but the air carried a tension he couldn't name, like something holding its breath. He sipped whiskey from a tin cup, staring into the fire. The flames danced in flickers of orange and blue, casting long fingers across the floor. For a moment his mind drifted, not to war, not to cattle or fences, but to the boy's face, calm, untouched by fear. It wasn't the look of someone taken by surprise. It was the look of someone who had known the end and accepted it. Smoke curled lazily up the flue, thick and fragrant with cedar. Thomas blinked. Then he saw him. At first it was just a blur, a shape inside the smoke. But then the edges sharpened. A young Apache man painted in ochre and charcoal, bare chest marked with symbols. He stood tall, motionless, gaze locked with Thomas's through the fire. Thomas didn't move. The figure didn't speak. But the weight in his eyes was unbearable, full of sorrow, judgment, and something else, recognition. The flames snapped higher, and the figure vanished. Thomas exhaled sharply, heart pounding. He leaned forward, hand hovering near his revolver, though he knew it would do no good. The air had changed. The cabin, once a place of refuge, now felt like a place of reckoning. He rose, walked to the door, and opened it wide. The night was still. No wind, no drums, just stars and a breathless hush. He stepped onto the porch and stared out toward the hills. He whispered without thinking, "What do you want from me?" No answer came. Back inside he sat again, staring at the fire. His hands trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from memory. From something he had buried long before the boy. He reached into a drawer and pulled out an old envelope yellowed with time. Inside were 2 letters and a photograph. 3 Apache children standing beside a missionary wagon, dusty and unsmiling. One of them had eyes like the boy he buried. He hadn't looked at that photo in years. He set the picture beside the fire and leaned back. The vision, if that's what it was, hadn't frightened him. It had stirred something deeper, an ache he thought long gone. And a question that had no shape yet, but pressed behind his ribs like a bruise. Then, as the fire dimmed to embers, a whisper came, not spoken aloud, but felt along the spine, as if carved into silence itself. "You have been seen." He didn't sleep that night. He sat by the ashes until morning, waiting for whatever would come next. Not with dread, but with the slow, steady breath of a man who knew the past doesn't stay buried, and that some graves open themselves. At dawn, the world returned to color, soft hues of blue and amber stretching across the valley. Thomas stepped out of the cabin, boots heavy with the sleepless night, the photo still tucked in his shirt pocket. The air was cold, but dry. No drums, no whispers. Just wind. He made for the pens, expecting the morning ritual to steady him, but as he approached, Bell's restless whinny cut through the calm. He rounded the corner and stopped dead. One of his steers, an old brindle with a torn ear, lay on its side, throat slashed, blood pooled dark around the body. The soil beneath was soaked, but what caught his eye wasn't the kill. It was the pattern in the dirt. The blood had spread in precise lines, 3 spirals intersecting with sharp points at each turn, not random, not made by coyotes or mountain cats. This was drawn. Thomas crouched, fingers hovering over the marks. They weren't just symbols, they were familiar. He had seen similar shapes carved on canyon walls during old patrols, signs the scouts wouldn't go near. Warnings, they said, not for the white man, for others. He stood and scanned the perimeter. No boot prints, no tracks. Whatever, or whoever, had done this left no trail. The steer's eyes were wide open, glassy, staring into nothing. He reached down and closed them, then fetched a tarp and covered the body. Back at the cabin, he sat with a cup of coffee that went untouched. His hands were still. His mind wasn't. The vision in the smoke, the drums, the grave, none of it was isolated now. Something had taken notice, and it wasn't finished. Later in town, he stopped at the general store for supplies. As he loaded a sack of grain onto his wagon, the blacksmith Albie Rourke leaned out from his shop. "You hear the talk?" Albie asked, voice low. "About what?" "Dead cattle. Couple down by the river, slit clean, some say Apache, others say worse." Thomas didn't reply, just tied the sack tight and nodded once. Albie stepped closer. "You did something, didn't you, up in those hills?" Thomas met his gaze. "I buried a boy." "That all?" "That's all." Albie spit in the dirt. "Well, folks don't like it. They say spirits got stirred. Say your place has got a shadow on it now." Thomas looked at the man, then to the dust-blown street beyond. Maybe it does. Back at the ranch, he stood alone again. The wind had picked up, whistling through the fences like a voice just out of reach. He lit a fire early, watched it burn. The photo was back on the mantel, the envelope beside it. He didn't believe in curses or omens or the ghosts men told stories about around saloons, but he believed in consequence, and in land that remembers what men try to forget. Out there, past the ridgeline, something was waiting, not to punish, not to forgive, just to be seen. That night, the wind came from the north. It carried no chill, yet it made Thomas shiver. The animals were quiet, too quiet. Even Belle, usually restless at dusk, stood still in her pen, ears forward, as if listening to something far beyond the fences. Thomas waited for the drums. But what came instead was worse. Whispers. They started soft, just wind, he told himself, but there was cadence, like speech barely caught beneath breath. He stood on the porch, hands at his sides, eyes on the distant ridge. The sky was a deep violet, stars cold and scattered. No fire burned in the cabin tonight. He hadn't lit it. Something told him to keep the dark. Then came a sound, not a voice, not a drum, but a shift in the silence, as though the ground exhaled. He saddled Belle without a word, strapped a canteen to the saddle horn and rode toward the hills. The land opened before him like a book too long left closed, juniper and rock, dry creek beds etched into the dust like veins. The moon rose behind him, casting shadows that moved differently than they should have. As he climbed the narrow trail, the whispers grew louder. Still no words he could make out, just emotion, sorrow, anger, curiosity, something ancient watching a trespasser return. He reached the crest by midnight. The world below was endless still. The grave wasn't visible from here, but he felt its direction in his bones. Then he saw them, figures, half seen, flickering between trees and stone, not solid, not smoke. Shapes formed from breath and memory. Dancers, maybe, or sentries, moving in slow arcs, arms raised, faces painted in moonlight and shadow. They didn't approach, didn't speak, but they were there. Thomas dismounted, letting Belle graze. He didn't draw his weapon. He walked forward slowly, each step deliberate, the soil beneath him soft, almost warm. Then the vision struck. A younger version of himself stood before him, 20 years vanished but perfectly remembered. The war uniform still clung to his body, dirty and torn. Blood on the sleeve. The eyes were his, but colder, harsher. Opposite that ghost stood a council of elders, 3, maybe 5. They didn't speak. They didn't move. But he felt their judgment. Not anger, not hate, just the weight of history and the cost of survival. The vision lasted a breath, maybe a lifetime. Then it was gone. Thomas stood alone on the ridge, heart pounding, mouth dry. The whispers faded like dew in the rising wind. He looked to the east. Dawn wasn't far, but the night hadn't ended. It had opened. He mounted Belle once more, and as they turned back toward the ranch, the path behind them was clear. No footprints, no signs, just the sense that something had passed through, and it had seen enough to decide what would come next. The sun rose behind him as Thomas reached the base of the hills. The morning light felt different, less like daybreak, more like exposure. Nothing moved around the ranch, no birdsong, no hoofbeats, just the steady creak of leather as he dismounted and tied Belle near the corral. He didn't go inside. Instead, he walked past the cabin, past the pens, past the well-worn trail into the dry brush that led toward the north ridge. His boots left soft impressions in the dust. The photo remained in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. As he climbed, the world felt smaller, tighter, as though space itself was closing in. He passed into a narrow canyon, its walls high and red, the air thick with the scent of creosote and old smoke. That's when he saw it. A ring of fire, unlit, encircling a wide, flat space in the canyon floor. Stones, perfectly placed, ashes old and layered, and around it, figures, not shadows, not illusions, men and women, silent and solemn, adorned in bone, paint, feathers. They stood without movement, each one facing the center. He didn't recognize their faces, but he recognized their presence. Keepers, witnesses, judges. Thomas stepped into the circle. No words passed between them, but meaning filled the air. This was no trial. This was a ritual. the kind where nothing is said aloud and everything is understood. He reached into his coat and pulled free the photograph, held it out. The image trembled in his fingers as he lowered it to the dirt. Then, without instruction, he removed his rifle. The old Winchester. Polished from years of care, worn from years of use. He laid it beside the photograph. Last, he pulled off his hat, worn and dusted, the brim cracked. He placed it on top of the rifle, the way soldiers did in farewell. He knelt, not in defeat, not in prayer, but in offering. The air thickened, the watchers remained still. Then, slowly, they began to move, not toward him, but around him, forming a slow circle. Their feet made no sound. Their eyes remained open. One woman stepped forward, paint across her eyes like wings. She knelt across from him, reached out and placed her palm on the ground between them. Her fingers dragged across the dust, forming a symbol, a spiral within a sunburst. Then she looked up. In that moment, Thomas felt the weight lift. Not all of it, not completely, but enough. The woman stood and turned away. The others followed, vanishing into the canyon walls like mist. Thomas remained kneeling as the wind stirred the ashes and the symbol faded. When he rose, the fire ring remained cold. His rifle and hat were untouched. But he knew what had changed. This land, this history, this blood, none of it had been forgotten. But maybe, just maybe, it had been heard. By the time Thomas returned to the ranch, the sun had risen high and warm. The wind was gentle again, brushing over the land like breath. The stillness that had haunted the days before was gone, replaced by something quieter, calmer, more alive. He walked past the cabin without entering, stopping near the edge of the fence line. From there he could see the burial site in the distance, just a low mound under a mesquite tree, barely visible unless you knew where to look. But he didn't need to look hard. At the center of the grave, where there had been only dry earth and stone, now grew a cluster of wild desert marigolds, bright yellow, delicate, swaying in the breeze, flowers where none should grow. Thomas stared at them a long time. Later, while chopping wood near the barn, he noticed movement on the road to town. A single rider approached, slow and steady. It was Deputy Calder, hat tilted back, rifle slung over his shoulder. "You got a minute?" Calder asked, reining in his horse near the gate. Thomas wiped sweat from his brow. "Always." The deputy dismounted. "Some folks said you'd be gone by now, headed north maybe, away from whatever's been stirring." "I'm still here." Calder nodded, looking out toward the hills. "Heard the drums again last night." "Faint, but there." Thomas didn't answer. Calder glanced at him. "Funny thing, we got a stranger came through town this morning. Apache woman, older than the hills, wrapped in black. Didn't say much, just left a bundle at the church door. Walked off into the desert. What was in the bundle? Cornmeal, tobacco. And this." He reached into his coat and pulled out a stone, smooth, dark, carved with a spiral sun. He handed it to Thomas. "Said it was for the one who buried her son." Thomas held the stone. It was warm in his hand. Calder gave him a long look. "You did right, Grady, even if nobody else sees it." He mounted his horse again. "Town's been quieter, less afraid, like whatever was here is moving on. Or settling in." Thomas watched him ride off, then turned the stone in his palm one last time before placing it beside the photo on the mantel. That evening, as the sun dipped low again, he sat on the porch with a tin cup of coffee, watching the sky burn orange and red. Above the grave, the marigolds swayed, and in the air, just barely, was a scent of sage. He didn't need the drums to know it was over. Something had changed, not just in him, but in the land. And while most of the town would go on pretending nothing had ever happened, Thomas Grady would remember, because he had seen the watchers. He had stepped into the fire. And come morning he would rise with the weight not lifted but accepted. The following week passed without incident. No blood, no whispers, no echoes. The hills held their peace, and the sky each night spread clean and clear above the ranch. But something inside Thomas remained unsettled, not uneasy, just unfinished, a thread still hanging, pulling gently at his chest. One morning, without fanfare, he packed a small satchel, tobacco, sage, a knife, and a bundle of dried corn. He saddled Belle and rode toward the northern ridge one final time. The trail was familiar now. The canyon walls seemed less imposing, the wind softer. When he reached the place of the burial, he dismounted and walked alone. The marigolds were still there, blooming stronger than before. Their petals glowed in the morning light, defiant against the dry earth. Thomas knelt beside them, unwrapped the bundle, and placed the offerings gently at the base of the mound. He whispered something, not a prayer, but a promise. Then he reached into his pocket and drew out the stone the deputy had given him. He set it atop the grave, pressing it firmly into the dirt. As he stood, a hawk circled overhead, silent, broad-winged, rising on a thermal. He stayed for a while longer, not speaking, not thinking, just standing in the presence of something greater than himself, something that had watched and judged and, perhaps, forgiven. Then he mounted Belle and turned back toward the ranch. Halfway home, he spotted movement by the river bend. A boy, maybe 10, crouched by the water's edge. Thomas slowed his horse, watching. The boy noticed him and stood, holding a stick like a rifle, face half-shadowed under a wide-brimmed hat, too big for his head. "You the one who buried him?" the boy asked. Thomas blinked. "I am. My grandma said you did it right, said she saw it in a dream." Thomas nodded slowly. "She might be right." The boy kicked at the dirt. "Is that why the flowers are growing?" Out in the hills, Thomas looked toward the north. "Could be." The boy seemed to think on that, then smiled. "I want to see him one day." "Maybe you will." The boy ran off, vanishing into the cottonwoods like a spirit too young to stay still. Thomas watched him go, heart oddly light. By late afternoon, he was back at the ranch. He unsaddled Belle, brushed her down, and sat on the porch with a jar of water and the last of his tobacco. The light turned golden. The land rested easy. Years from now, he knew someone else would find the grave. Maybe the boy, maybe someone like him. And they'd see the stone, the marigolds, the marks in the dirt, and maybe they'd understand. Some debts can't be paid in coin or cattle. Some stories don't need to be told aloud. They only need to be remembered. Years passed, but the story didn't fade. It lingered in whispers, in wind, in the way the sun touched the hills north of the Grady Ranch. Most folks forgot the specifics. They moved on, raised fences, sold land, buried new bones. But some things, though left behind, never really go. They echo. Long after Thomas Grady was gone, a traveler came through the valley. A writer, curious about the old stories. Locals pointed him north, spoke of drums once heard, flowers blooming where no seed should sprout, and a lone rancher who'd buried an Apache boy during the height of tensions. Some called him mad, others called him marked, a few called him brave. The writer found the grave easily. The trail had softened with time, but the land still remembered. The marigolds had returned, blooming strong as ever. The stone remained, worn now, but its spiral sun still visible. And around the base were tokens, feathers, beads, dried corn, smooth stones, signs that others had come, that others still came. He didn't touch anything, just stood in silence, taking notes, then left without a word. Back in town, an old woman at the trading post told him, "We never heard the drums again, not like that. But when the moon turns red and the wind's just right, you can feel it. Not fear, not warning, just something watching, not angry, just remembering." The writer asked her why the grave had never been moved, marked properly, protected by law. She smiled. "Because it's not meant to be owned. It's meant to be known." He never published the story, said it felt wrong to put it in ink, said it belonged to the land, not the page, and so it stayed there, in the rocks and wind and roots. Every so often a child in town would ask about the flowers in the hills. And someone older, sometimes a teacher, sometimes a grandmother, sometimes just a quiet hand on a shoulder would say, "That's where a man listened when no one else would." The story lived because it wasn't forced. It grew because it was true. In a world of noise, a whisper like that lasts forever. So if you ever ride through Arizona near the Dragoon Mountains, and the wind dies for a second too long, or the coyotes go quiet, and something presses gentle against your spine, don't fear it. Just listen. Because maybe that's all it ever wanted. A man once buried a fallen boy not out of duty but out of decency, and in doing so he touched something eternal. Something older than war, older than hate, older even than the land itself. If stories like this stir your soul, hit that subscribe button and click on the next tale waiting for you on screen. The drums are still calling,